чтобы все присоединились.
Не сами виноваты, надо было раньше приходить. Ура!
Отлично. So, to everyone present here in our auditorium and in Zoom auditorium, I'll now introduce our guest in Russian, and my colleague here, co-translator Anastasia, will give a brief summary of Helen's work. And then the Helen herself will start her wonderful lecture. Приветствую всех, кто дошел, кто еще доходит из наших студентов и слушателей в Zoom. Приветствуем вас, что вы нашли время к нам подключиться. Значит, меня зовут Михаил, это Анастасия. Мы были переводчиками, Анастасия в большей степени, конечно. Мы были переводчиками в работ Хелен, посвященных посттрудовому обществу и вообще эмансипаторный потенциал технологий. Недавно мы перевели ее статью с ее коллегой и мужем Ником Сырничком, которая называется «Кризис социального воспроизводства и конец работы». И сегодня так уж получилось удачно, что Хелен нашла время и будет нам как раз более полно и подробно раскрывать аспекты того, чем она занимается и чем вообще, что такое посттрудовое общество, технологии, с чем их вообще едят. Вот сейчас Анастасия расскажет пару слов, собственно, о чем, над чем Хелен работает.
Привет, меня зовут Настя. Очень приятно, что вас так много. Спасибо, что пришли. В общем, Хелен — это соосновательница феминистского коллектива Лабория Кубоникс. Да, вот это и соавторка ксенофеминистского манифеста. Вот эта книжка. На самом деле она не такая большая, это просто много картинок. И она очень красивая. Которую она... Вот. И, собственно, соосновательница такого направления, как ксенофеминизм, который, наверное, в истории философской мысли можно в определенной степени возвести к киберфеминизму Донны Харуэй, но если киберфеминизм задействует фигуру киборга как некий мыслительный эксперимент, то Хелен и ее коллежанки подходят к вопросу технологий более конкретно и используют их эмансипаторный потенциал, изучают их эмансипаторный потенциал и политическую ангажированность. Вот. Наверное, это все, что могу сказать.
Yeah, now I'll give Helen the floor, and after her lecture, we'll be receiving questions from you if they appear, and I'll be translating them directly to Helen. So, comrade Hester, now it's your turn.
Thank you. Right, can you the mic? I can hear.
What?
Can you mute your mic?
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. It's just there's a bit of reverb, which is, thank you. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here and for sharing your time with me today. This talk, which has sort of developed out of a conversation with Mikhail, what he wanted to talk about today, is going to consider post-work politics in relation to technology. Looking first at discussions of technological unemployment, I'm going to point to some of the ways in which discourses of full automation might be considered problematic. Important here will be the role of technology within one gendered and often forgotten sphere of labour, that is social reproduction. What do post-work proposals around automation miss when it comes to things like paid and unpaid care. Whilst acknowledging that there have indeed been lacunas, omissions and failings within post-work projects so far, I want to argue that they can nevertheless offer conceptual and practical resources for the pursuit of more emancipatory futures. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, so first things first, what do we mean when we talk about post-work politics? Or rather, what do I mean when I talk about post-work politics? My understanding of this term is deliberately expansive. Post-work incorporates a variety of strategies, perspectives, and worldviews that do not always agree with each other, and which may, in fact, exist in a state of tension. Material under the post-work umbrella falls along a spectrum, ranging from analyses primarily grounded in the critique of existing conditions, to those which are more speculative in imagining a new social order. Even amongst avowedly left-wing thinkers, these are there's a sort of notable variety within post-work. So writers will suture their perspectives on life after work to differing political ambitions, be they anarchist, communist, or social democratic. Although post-work projects each have their own distinctive flavour, however, they nevertheless hold certain key ideas in common. They respond to changing labour conditions, often seeking to confront rising inequality, the erosion of autonomy, and ever more precarious working arrangements. They typically critique the idea that work is capable of delivering prosperity, purpose, or social equality, and argue instead that the left needs to resist wage labour and the work ethic as part of a proactive response to the current crisis. Work, these theorists argue, must be framed as a problem rather than a solution, and we must be seeking to emancipate ourselves from rather than through our labour. And it's that idea, I think, that's at the heart of post-work. So, what is the role of technology here? I think automation enjoys a particularly high profile when it comes to current understandings of post-work. And it's not really hard to see why. So it's kind of central to the playful sloganeering that has emerged around this position. So fully automated luxury communism, or FALC for short, is the title of Aaron Bastani's recent book. And it's also a long-standing meme, sometimes taking the modified form of fully automated luxury gay space communism. And the front cover of Nick Cernick and Alex Williams's Inventing the Future features the programmatic slogan, demand full automation. So I myself have a tote bag that's got these demands on it. So, you know, the automation has been kind of circulating around the discourse of post-work in very obvious, if playful ways. But the significance of automation to contemporary post-work goes beyond this quest for maximum slogan density. Let me quickly illustrate this with reference to some millennial and post-millennial manifestos. So let's start with the post-work manifesto by Stanley Aronowitz, Dawn Esposito, William DeFazio, and Margaret Yard, for example. First published in 1998, it argues against the work ethic and in favour of a shorter working day. Like Cernick and Williams, it advocates for a guaranteed basic income as a means by which to support the transition away from current levels of waged employment. Crucially, it also points to the role of automation in reshaping labour practices and declares that the bare fact is that technological change can be used to displace all categories of workers, including managers and professionals. The example that they use comes from computer-aided design, and they point to the way that within engineering, we are seeing the sort of shrinking and sort of transformation of the drafting profession. And then a year after this comes Crisis Group's Manifesto Against Labour, which clearly shares some of the same concerns. It declares that as a result of the development of microelectronics, more labour is rationalised away than can be reabsorbed by expansion of markets. As a logical consequence of rationalisation, electronic robotics replaces human energy or new communication technology and makes labour superfluous. And this is framed not as something which must sort of at all costs be resisted, but as a moment of political opportunity for a new post-capitalist social order. Why, the manifesto asks, should we spend long hours in assembly shops or offices when machines of all kind can do such work? Why should hundreds of human bodies get into a sweat when only a few harvesters can achieve the same result? Why should we busy our intellect with dull routine when computers can easily accomplish the objects? In place of a culture dominated by the work ethic, crisis groups propose the automation of unsatisfying drudgery and give priority to the restoration of a culture of leisure. So into the 21st century, we see the sort of extension and the intensification of these currents, with the 2010s in particular witnessing the emergence of a range of agenda-setting post-work texts. Williams and Cernick's Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics from 2013 suggests that we should accelerate the process of technological evolution because the existing infrastructure of productive forces can be seen as a springboard to launch to post-capitalism. This idea is later developed in Inventing the Future, which explicitly argues for a fully automated economy. Using the latest technological developments, the authors declare, such an economy would liberate humanity from the drudgery of necessary labour, while simultaneously producing increasing amounts of wealth. Without full automation, post-capitalist futures must necessarily choose between abundance at the expense of freedom, e.g. the productivism of Soviet Russia, or freedom at the expense of abundance, e.g. primitivism. With automation, by contrast, machines can increasingly produce the necessary goods and services while also liberating humanity from the effort of producing them. For this reason, we argue that the tendencies towards automation and the replacement of human labour should be enthusiastically accelerated and targeted as a political project of the left. So that was a quote from Inventing the Future. Okay, so then just one final example. I want to return to Falk here. So this idea was articulated by Bastani in 2014, first in an 8-minute video for the leftist platform Novara Media, and then in an article for Vice magazine. In these short introductory materials, Bastani spells out a clear post-work position. He remarks that existing jobs seem increasingly likely to be eradicated through automation, that economic recovery no longer appears reliant upon job creation, and that the left needs to develop an appropriate response to this situation. Such a response must not fall back on the unwarranted celebration of work, but should instead seize the opportunities presented by technological transformation to ensure a drastically reduced working week and thus more time for individual flourishing. And Bastani fleshes these ideas out in 2019's Fully Automated Luxury Communism Manifesto, arguing that a new machine age will herald ever greater technological unemployment as progressively more physical and cognitive labour is performed by machines rather than humans. In his account, the modern transistor and integrated circuit are on course to unleash the same kind of social disruption, the same kind of scale of disruption as did the steam engine before them. Okay, so for the post-work thinkers that I've mentioned here, automation, be that as a kind of looming encroachment, an emancipatory political ambition, or both, takes on particular significance. The kind of technology-centric future casting in which they engage chimes nicely with that perennial preoccupation of policymakers and journalists alike, the idea of robots stealing our jobs. It's perhaps no surprise then that an embrace of automation, whether as a proactive call or as an attempt to make a virtue out of necessity, has come to be viewed as perhaps the defining attribute of post-work discourse. And certainly it's something to which post-work's most strident critics frequently return. Anna Dinnerstein and Frederick Pitts, for example, describe post-work as consisting of three primary positions. So, quote, first, the development of information technology is accelerating. Allied with crisis tendencies in the current phase of capital accumulation, this terminates in a post-capitalist future. Second, dynamics of automation and new cooperative commons potentiate a post-work society of abundance and leisure. Third, progressive left politics must surpass limited, reactive and parochial folk politics, reconfiguring itself around a populist hegemonic post-work agenda, demanding reduced working hours, full automation and a UBI. So three attributes there, all of which contain some reference to technology or automation. As we shall see, I personally don't think these kinds of characterization hold a great deal of water. But claims of this kind do tell us something about contemporary perceptions of post-work. For many, the technologization of labor is post-work's flagship idea. Given the high profile enjoyed by automation in this context, it's worth pausing to consider some of the ways in which the analyses offered by post-work thinkers are problematic, or even flat out wrong. In a highly rigorous and carefully evidenced argument about technology and the future of work, Aaron Benenov looks at the claim that, for good or ill, automation is on track to eradicate substantial amounts of human labor. According to his analysis, today's automation discourse, a current that includes sort of tech-centric post-work thinkers and assorted other futurologists, can be seen as a response to a real trend unfolding across the world. There are simply too few jobs for too many people. This chronic labor underdemand is manifest in economic trends such as jobless recoveries, stagnant wages, and rampant job insecurity. However, Benenov suggests that it would be misguided to chalk this up to the rise of the robots, not least because the countries with the most industrial manufacturing robots are not the ones with the fewest humans employed in industrial manufacturing. According to Benenov, what automation theorists describe as the result of rising technological dynamism is actually the consequence of worsening economic stagnation, following on decades of manufacturing overcapacity and underinvestment. In other words, as economic growth decelerates, rates of job creation slow, and it is this, not technology-induced job destruction, that has depressed the global demand for labor. To the extent that post-work politics assume we're already hurtling towards an automated future, they are fundamentally flawed. Further objections to the post-work demand for full automation concentrate on things like its focus and its scope. Although arguing forcefully for the importance of freedom from work, for example, and pushing against any idea that people should be compelled to sell their labor at all, the philosopher Martin Hägglund suggests that we must look beyond the reorganization of work and change our fundamental conception of value if we want a more just future. He notes that the key to the critique of capitalism is the revaluation of value. The foundation of capitalism is the measure of wealth in terms of socially necessary labor time. In contrast, the overcoming of capitalism requires that we measure our wealth in terms of socially available free time. Interestingly, for our purposes, Hägglund follows Marx in pursuing this line of thinking with reference to efficiency-enhancing technologies. Technologies which, when put to use in the service of a capitalist conception of value, are inevitably used to increase output rather than to reduce workloads. As long as our measure of wealth is socially necessary labor time, machine technologies cannot produce any value for us by virtue of their operations. The technologies that could make us wealthier, that could give us more time to lead our lives, are instead employed to exploit human labor, even when such labor is not needed. If we measured our wealth in terms of socially available free time, however, machines would produce value for us by virtue of their own operations. according to Haglund. Any post-work position on automation, this reading suggests, will fail to foster genuine transformations if not coupled with a radical rethinking of what constitutes value. So other critics point to the fact that a politics of technologically facilitated working time reduction is not, in and of itself, a sufficient basis for a developed emancipatory politics. As Alain Badiou points out in his response to Inventing the Future, while the shortening of the working week is a highly desirable proposal, post-capitalism must be defined not by the end of work, but by the end of private property. He notes that private property can be extended to all forms of automation, and that this appropriation of all forms of technology by the system of private property is at the heart of the matter, before going on to argue that any reinvention of the future must start from this point, rather than from any attempts to automate work. So he says, we can say that it's not a necessity, that the key of social organization lies in private property and monstrous inequalities. And we must affirm that we can organize limited experiences for the moment, which demonstrates that it is not a necessity, that it is not true that forever private property and monstrous inequalities must be the law of the becoming of humanity. If post-work draws on the idea that capital can become labor, then it would clearly be inadvisable for it to concentrate on labor at the exclusion of capital. And the final issue that I want to talk about with regards to post-work's treatment of automation is its tendency to privilege some forms of work over others. It's a common critique leveled at post-work positions that they rely on a fairly limited conception of what counts as work. Generally, post-work is accused of focusing on masculinized forms of wage labor at the expense of feminized varieties of paid and unpaid work. And more specifically, it's accused of failing to account for social reproduction. By this, I mean the web of processes that together maintain and reproduce life, things like care work and housework, as well as species reproduction. By regenerating the workforce, both daily and generationally, social reproduction is the often forgotten foundation of global capitalism. And post-work has been accused of continuing this sort of rather inauspicious tradition of neglect. So let's just pause to consider this claim in relation to the manifestos that we started with. In the post-work manifesto, the prevalent assumption is that work equals financially remunerated activity beyond the domestic sphere. And the developments in automation and roboticization will contribute to the end of such activity. Social reproduction is largely sidelined, making a late appearance only in the final 2 pages of the 49-page text. When it is discussed, it is in the context of public service and massive care facilities, suggesting that the primary concern here may be waged work in the caring professions. This is despite the fact that the distribution of unwaged reproductive labor makes a significant contribution to global inequality. In every country in the world for which we have data, women spend more time than men on unwaged work, on average 3.3 times as much. A manifesto against labor, meanwhile, is quite direct in its attempts to address social reproduction. Its response to the inequitable division of unwaged domestic labor is to propose its redistribution across a wider section of the population, a redistribution facilitated by the post-work society. When, along with the abolition of labor, the gender segregation will dissolve, they write, these essential activities can be brought to light of a conscious social reorganization beyond gender stereotypes. The problem with social reproduction, this analysis suggests, has less to do with the character of the activities involved than it does with their tendency to dominate one's life. The repressive character of the chores will dissolve as soon as people are no longer subsumed under what essentially constitutes their life, argues the manifesto. Now, there's something rather unsettling about those arguments, I think. So just consider the quotes that I shared with you here. So gender segregation will dissolve. The repressive character of the chores will dissolve. The manifesto prioritizes the active refusal of that, which it considers to be labour. Once that terrain has been transformed, gender forms of oppression will supposedly just liquefy and evaporate. There is therefore no attempt to articulate a specifically feminist post-work struggle here. An unwaged reproductive labour within the family or the household is once again condemned to the sidelines to some extent. 15 years separates the post-work and accelerationist manifestos. That's a further decade and a half of feminist scholarship querying the exclusion of social reproduction, both within and beyond the family, from these critiques of work. Still, however, Cernick and Williams make no reference to reproductive labour. It is left unclear in this text how issues such as unremunerated care and housework factor into their analysis, and whether or not their arguments for repurposing capitalism's technical infrastructure could in any way minimise the burdens of this work. A number of feminist commentators remarked upon this at the time. To their minds, any consideration of reproductive labour would immediately illuminate left accelerationism's terminal deficiencies. No matter who controlled the technology, they argued, and under which conditions, care could not just be automated away. As such, accelerationism's fascination with the unleashed powers of technology could only hold emancipatory promise for those willing to forget about an entire domain of work. Now, to their credit, Cernick and Williams do take these arguments on board in Inventing the Future. They make mention of social reproduction when discussing their demand for full automation, acknowledging that some barriers to a fully automated economy may never be overcome. Aside from technical and economic hurdles, they point to the moral status we give to certain jobs, such as affective and care labour. These are tasks which many would argue have to be carried out by human labour, e.g. the work of raising a child. Although it is encouraging to see reproductive labour being taken into account here, we should also remember that Cernick and Williams bluntly define work as our jobs. So this is a quote, work is our wage labour, the time and effort we sell to someone else in return for an income. So once again, we can see that this sort of tendency to set aside unwaged social reproduction is in evidence here. And Falk comes into similar difficulties. As with the Accelerationist Manifesto, early efforts at advancing Falk were primarily concerned with transformations resulting from or occurring within the realm of wage labour. The activities of unwaged social reproduction are largely skimmed over, and it's clear that they are somewhat less central to the process of communist automation being envisaged. Although feminists were, again, quick to remark on this at the time, 2019's book-length extension of the project does little to redress the issue. The use of industrial robots in manufacturing is the first piece of evidence Bastani uses to support his claim that we're reaching peak human. And he argues that it is in this sector where, just as with horses in the opening decades of the 20th century, the old world will transition to the new more quickly than many imagine. So Bastani touches briefly on logistics, retail, and warehousing in his chapter on full automation. But as with the post-work manifesto, discusses care only in its final pages. At this point, he gestures towards the Da Vinci robot used by surgeons and the role of AI in diagnostics. That is, to trends in the augmentation of highly skilled and highly paid professional labour, rather than to the automation of those low-pay, low-prestige caring tasks that make up the bulk of employment in this sector. Additionally, he doesn't consider the home as either a waged or an unwaged workplace in his discussion on full automation. As such, it can hardly be said to be full automation that's really at stake here. In some ways, this is disappointing, but perhaps it would be better to understand this form of post-work as being more akin to post-jobs, a valuable but partial contribution to be woven together with other strands of a post-work perspective. So, we've considered a number of critiques up to this point. Post-work, 1, misinterprets the role of automation in the current global undersupply of work. 2, fails to properly account for the role of private property in shaping the dynamics of technologies. 3, does little to address the issue of value, which heavily shapes how the forces of production are operationalized. And 4, excludes certain kinds of labor from its purview, thereby risking the replication of gendered inequalities. How can a post-work advocate respond to these not inconsiderable problems? Is the post-work project fundamentally doomed on account of its take on automation? I'd like to think not. In response to the first critique, we can note that whilst some of post-work's discussion of technological unemployment may indeed misconceive of the reasons behind chronic global labour under-demand, said under-demand is nevertheless still an issue. Indeed, as Benanav argues, automation theorists have at least focused the world's attention on the real problem of a consistently low demand for labour. They have also excelled in efforts to imagine solutions to this problem that are broadly emancipatory in nature. There is still much to be gleaned from post-work theorists, it would seem, even if the starting point for their analyses can be rather wide of the mark. Besides, post-work projects also have motivations entirely independent of changes in the labour market. The culture of work is seen as something to be resisted, whether or not robots are currently taking jobs. This is a point to which I'm going to return in a moment. What then of accusations surrounding the exclusion of social reproduction from post-work's technological imaginaries? I think we need to approach this question by first pointing to what post-work and the critical reactions to it have in common. After all, if accelerationism, Falk, and other related projects exclude gendered reproductive labour from the field of transformation, so too do many of their feminist critics. Those who so rightly remark upon post-work's failure to provide a robust political response to alleviating the burdens of reproductive labour tend similarly to position this labour as intractable, a problem that cannot be solved. So let me explain what I mean. There's a Libcom post about Falk, which insists that care robots and other forms of automation are, quote, ill-suited to accommodate the complex needs, requirement for human interaction, and demands for dignity and agency, which must be a key part of the provision of care in any future communist society. Now, such statements are unlikely to prove controversial in post-work circles. Many of the thinkers that we've been discussing today would probably agree, as reflected in the fact that they either avoid talking about automation in relation to social reproduction, or explicitly state that the automation of care isn't the point. The reader of Manifesto Against Labour, for example, is told that much social reproduction cannot and should not be automated. So, quote, what will not vanish under a post-work society are housekeeping and the care for people who become invisible under the conditions of the labour society. Basically, all those activities that were separated from political economy and stamped female. Such comments point to a tension within post-work perspectives, I think. Forms of work that are mainly and problematically associated with cis men are explicitly treated as labour that must be resisted, refused, and through automation, transcended. The responses to forms of work that have conventionally, and again, problematically, been gendered as feminine, meanwhile, are rather less ambitious. For those currently performing it, it may be somewhat galling to hear that, quote, all those activities that have been stamped female will not vanish. In the absence of efforts to articulate a transformative vision of reproductive labour in terms of either social relations or technological advancement, the implication is that we must reconcile ourselves to work that cannot or should not be minimised. This might prompt us to ask, as Silvia Federici does of the slow-growing economy, is this picture of a life built entirely around reproducing oneself and others not the life that women have always had? And are we not hearing again the same glorification of housework, which has traditionally served to justify its unpaid status? Personally, I don't think it's helpful for either post-work positions or feminist critiques to start from an assumption about the fundamentally unautomatable character of housework or care work. Reproductive labour should not be allowed to become a sacred cow, something that's seen as a sphere of revaluation, sure, potentially redistribution, but never actual meaningful reduction. An openness to the automation of some types of social reproduction can be seen as a refusal to naturalise this work, to wave it away as not really work at all, but an expression of the gendered self or a personally rewarding pastime. And let's be frank, some parts of this work deserve to be given the boot. In the course of a conversation about Falk, James Butler raises a critical point about care and automation. Whilst Bastani largely dismisses the scope for the automation of reproductive labour, Butler, who is otherwise much more critical of the luxury communist project, points to the possible benefits of technologies of care. Automation can do very, very good things, he says, like remove the kind of simple, basic caring functions that so many carers have to undertake and frees them to be in other kinds of emotional relations. This points to one area where technologies could provide real social advantages, reducing the need for high-touch care, which is often very hard on carer and cared for alike, to further enable high-talk care, the kind of engaging and stimulating work which, for some, comes closest to an idea of autonomous activity, social, intellectual, and creative engagement, that kind of thing. So I'm not making any claims about the likelihood or even the possibility of the emergence of specific suitable tech here. That's a rather bigger topic for another day. Instead, I'm making a rather more general claim. We should not take the unautomatable quality of reproductive labour to be axiomatic or enshrine it as a kind of welcome inevitability. Its transformation should be as important for high-tech post-work imaginaries as that of any other form of labour. Butler finishes by adding, crucially, that to deal with care requires social change. It requires social revolution. And this is quite true. Whilst I understand that roboticisation should not be lauded incautiously, a critical technopolitics of the home and other spaces of social reproduction, when combined with a commitment to rethinking all aspects of the current arrangement of reproductive labour, could provide real benefits. The idea that an emphasis on automation necessarily excludes social reproduction should, I would argue, be rejected. A further, more general response to the deficiencies of post-work's technological vision is to note that, despite its high profile, the call for automation is far from the be-all and end-all of post-work politics. Amongst critics, as we've seen, post-work is often construed as inseparable from, if not identical to, the call for automated production. This characterization, however, can only hold if one is willing to overlook other tendencies and exclude a number of thinkers from the post-work canon. Take the work of Kathy Weeks, for example. Published in 2011, The Problem with Work, Feminism, Marxism, Anti-Work Politics, and Post-Work Imaginaries popularized the notion of post-work thinking in this century. It is cited approvingly by Cernick and Williams, as well as in related texts, such as David Frame's The Refusal of Work and Sophie Lewis's Full Surrogacy Now. The strength and influence of Weeks's text would seem to position it at the very heart of contemporary post-work politics. It calls for a shorter working week and for a universal basic income, but talk of full automation and largely of technology in general is absent from the text. One can only frame post-work as a perspective wedded to technological acceleration if one willfully ignores Weeks's influence here. One could equally point to Frame's book to demonstrate that automation prognostications need not necessarily inform post-work writing. would even be tempted to include Benenav's critique of automation discourse beneath the banner of post-work, given not only that it argues against the current global undersupply of work, argues that the current global undersupply of work demands a proactive response from the left, but also that the final chapter spends a good deal of time imagining what a world without work could look like and what we should be collectively striving for. Even many texts that do foreground ideas of full automation retain a focus on political struggle. None of the authors mentioned here presume that a reduction in waged work or the erosion of the work ethic will come easily or without labour struggles. But the purpose of their texts is to reignite conversations about working time and desirable futures. More crucial than any of this, though, is the need to reject the idea that post-work politics is little more than a collection of policy proposals, be these for a shorter working week, for a universal basic income, or for the greater automation of labour. Such a framing misses what is most crucial for the project, the ends towards which it strives. Weeks, Cernick, Williams, Frayne, and others in the contemporary Anglophone post-work tradition are making the case for why the reduction of toil could and should guide our political visions of the future. They are making this case against the widespread dogma of work that prescribes the idea that progress is simply more jobs or higher wages, a political horizon, we should remember, that has dominated labour movements for decades. Hence, whilst Haglund and Benenav disagree with post-work thinkers when it comes to elements of both diagnosis and prescription, they can still be considered fellow travellers, given their commitment to a political project of extending the realm of freedom. Haglund in particular does a great deal to explore the practical and philosophical underpinnings of what constitutes freedom, centering this discussion around work, value, and free time, and touching on automation in the process. As he puts it, the aim of the revaluation of value is to transform our conception of social wealth in such a way that it reflects our commitment to free time. The degree of our wealth is the degree to which we have the resources to engage the question of what we ought to do with our lives, which depends on the amount of socially available free time. To be wealthy is to be able to engage the question of what to do on Monday morning, rather than be forced to go to work in order to survive. This, more than any specific attitude towards the possibilities of automation, identifies Haglund as sitting within, or at least alongside, the post-work project, rather than against it. When post-work thinkers make demands or propose concrete actions, these are typically steps towards a larger goal, rather than being endpoints in and of themselves. Why push for automation, working time reduction, and UBI? Indeed, why push for a move away from cultures of work at all? Because, post-work advocates argue, these things facilitate new forms of human flourishing. That's what's important here. Okay, so let's sum up. Post-work politics has understandably been associated with the call for and expectation of full automation, and with the limitations that such a politics involves. However, not everything assumed to be a check on the automation imaginary is actually a hard and fast limit, as I have suggested in my approach to technologies of care. Furthermore, not all elements of post-work concern themselves with automation, and many of those that do may still provide us with useful conceptual resources. Finally, it would be an error to reduce post-work to simple agitation for automation, or indeed to any single concrete demand. At its heart, post-work is not a self-contained program of neatly numbered steps, but a radical orientation towards freedom. As Cernick and Williams put it, the ambition here is to take back the future from capitalism and build ourselves the 21st century world that we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks. Right now, we'll start receiving some questions from us and from the audience.
Give me 1 second. I can hear an alarm going off somewhere in my house. I'm going to go and turn it off, and then I'll come back. So gather the questions. I'll be right back without my alarm going off.
Okay. пока Хелен занимается домашней неавтоматизированным трудом, готовьте себе вопросы.
Да. Может, у кого-то есть вопросы? Мы пока это...
Можем принести вам микрофоны.
Да.
У меня есть вопрос, но должны хватать.
Угу.
Спасибо, классная была лекция. Только английский слишком быстрый. Была очень хорошо изложена вот эта концепция, начиная от Розы Люксембург, про объемы вот этого труда жизненного. А вот критическую часть про капитализм собственности, капитализм труда было не очень понятно.
So Helen, if you are with us, we can start with the questions.
Let's go.
Я думаю, можно перевести то, что Алла сказала.
Ну, там не вопрос.
Ну, ладно.
We'll start with ourselves, with me and Anastasia, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. Ask away. Okay, I'll ask first. So Helen, would you like to close your screen sharing?
Yes. There we go.
Okay. So my question will be, what particular ways of achieving post-war society or communist society can be implemented politically right now, besides demands for UBI, for full monetization, and so on and so on? Where particular emancipatory potential of technology can be used in the recent radical political activism?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because you go from where the end point of that talk, which was about the more philosophical or Promethean ideas about an orientation towards freedom, and taking it back to the sort of the concrete and the practical of like, well, what do we actually do? I think you sort of mention like radical activism, and obviously there's a huge kind of role to be played there. But I think it's important to think about an ecology of organization. So the way different forms or scales or approaches can interact together to try to push the possibilities of freedom in particular directions. So one of the things that I've kind of been contributing to, the projects that I've been contributing to actively, is through the work of think tanks. So Autonomy in the UK, I sit on the board of advisors there, and they've been pushing for things like a shorter working week. And they do that by these very sort of moderate seeming approaches of working with companies that want to shorten the working week, working with municipal governments to suggest how they could introduce reduced working hours within their sort of regions, and then sort of lobbying political parties to introduce the idea of a shorter working week into their policy platforms. And necessarily that form of approach requires a certain way of speaking, a certain way of engaging, which is very palatable to people who already have institutional and political power. So quite often that involves framing things in terms of, oh, well, think about the productivity gains that come with a shorter working week, for example. And so you borrow a kind of the language and perspective of the sort of the political mainstream as part of a project to try and steer it in more radical directions. But of course, the risk is in doing that, you completely end up capitulating to the existing common sense about what counts. So, you know, using a discourse of productivity to argue for a shorter working week, it goes against that kind of idea of revaluing value, for example, that Hegel comes up with. So what's really important is to think about how that form of organization can intersect with more radical currents. So what you need is the more radical currents of grassroots activism continually pushing sort of any sort of more party politics, sort of policy-based proposals in a more radical direction, and having this sort of interaction between different levels and different scales to try and create a situation where a politics that's oriented towards freedom becomes increasingly possible. And so it is encouraging to see things like the Trade Union Congress in the UK, for example, after, you know, for the first time in quite a long time, I think it was last year, they sort of introduced this idea that a shorter working week, less work, should be something that trade unions are advocating for and agitating for, rather than simply higher wages and safer conditions. So for a long time, the labour movement has been focused around higher wages in particular, and to start finding a way of fostering this idea that actually less work is an admirable goal. But, you know, let's push towards that. Let's imagine a left-wing politics that isn't oriented around the celebration of labour. And, you know, it's one way to do that, but it's sort of frustratingly incremental, and it does involve quite a lot of compromise, that position, which is why it's so important to have these more utopian, these more kind of decisive, this more emphatic currents of anti-work politics to ensure that we don't lose sight of what we are labouring towards, you know.
Thank you.
So, Helen, when we translated recently your article with Nick, Crisis of Social Reproduction and the End of Work, you get some critique from our friend and Nancy Fraser's student Anastasia Kalk. So I want to redirect her question to you. So the most important, the most interesting thing in her critique is why don't you talk about the rationalization of reproductive labor?
Oh, the rationalization of reproductive labor. Yeah, it's very interesting. We do actually in the book, we talk a lot about, because we have a whole chapter about architecture in space. And within that, there is this really interesting history of experiments with taking sort of Taylorist principles of time motion studies in order to rationalize wage labor, particularly on assembly lines, and trying to apply those to the home. So thinking about the kitchen as a workspace and how that can be laid out and organized in a way that facilitates reproductive labor, that lessens the sort of the burdens of reproductive labor. So that's a really interesting strand of a sort of anti-work ambition embedded at the level of sort of material hegemony, the way values get embedded within particular spaces through the way that they're constructed and built. But there's actually quite a lot of issues with the way those experiments have played out historically. So to take the example of the Frankfurt kitchen. So the Frankfurt kitchen was one of these attempts to map out how women were using kitchens in the 30s, how they moved around them, how they engaged with them, and try and produce a kitchen that was maximally suitable for those workers. But what you end up with is a kitchen that is tailored for one single worker, and particularly for one single mother figure. So all of the counters were designed to sit at the level of sort of an average woman's height. So it was, and they were designed for the one worker moving around this space. So actually, in attempting to rationalize that labor, what happens is you end up designing a space that sort of enshrines that woman, a single woman, cis woman, within this space. You know, so you can't get people in to help you because the kitchen has been designed to be small so you can move around it quickly. you know, all of the counters are designed to be at the appropriate height for the average woman labourer. So actually, instead of creating more opportunities for reimagining that work, it actually just enables a sort of adaptation to that work as it stands. So it loses its emancipatory dimension. So whilst the sort of the ambition is an admirable one, the way that it has played out concretely is not quite so positive.
Thanks. And maybe you could talk to us about the race aspect, about the global north, global south, in the context of reproductive labor.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think the crucial thing when you talk about the automation of reproductive labor is this idea that first of all, it is something that is basically happening in the wealthier nations. Where we see these technologies of social reproduction emerging, it is for wealthy, affluent, nuclear family households in the global north. But one of the reasons why take-up of some potential labor-saving technologies has been sort of suppressed, and also one reason why the development of these technologies has been so slow has been what Nick and I call the maids over machines principle. So essentially, the technologies haven't taken off or haven't become sort of central in the sort of imaginaries of the home, because you already have a more reliable labor source that is cheaper in the form of human workers. And that by human workers, we're talking about a hyper-exploited class of nannies, maids, cleaners, who very often are coming from the global south or from sort of former Soviet countries into the Northern Europe or into the states in Northern America. So you have this situation where actually there's no incentive for people to take up these technologies, which are unproven, are less reliable. And so you actually have this situation where it is people from less affluent countries who are being treated as if they are machines for reproductive labor, rather than actually providing technologies for that purpose. And of course, the consequence of that is you are displacing what is a problem that wealthier women experience, of this tension between work and in the wage sector and unwaged reproductive labor. You are seeing that issue addressed by giving that work to a hyper-exploited class of workers. And the consequence of that is those hyper-exploited workers just have the issue displaced onto them. So they are involved in these global chains of care where they are themselves having to figure out how they combine waged work with the burdens of social reproduction, and getting involved in this situation where the issue is constantly displaced and the reproductive crisis is never actually addressed. You know, so it's actually one reason why it's so important that we start to think about, that we bring our transformative imaginaries to social reproduction, is so that we just don't end up just exacerbating that problem further and further through the exploitation of workers from the global south and elsewhere.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Questions from the audience. I'll give you the microphone.
Ты его включил?
Thank you so much. I have two questions that are related to each other. First, you wrote the human flourishing as a kind of goal, which is, of course, the Marxist idea behind the free time communism. But it's absolutely unclear, at least from your talk, what people are going to do to flourish? I mean, I'm sorry, it's an obvious question. I assume it's written many times, but as a newcomer to this topic, I have this stupid question. Aren't these people going just to watch TV all the time? And the TV scripts will be written by robots, of course, like maths. And so we will be further plunged into this cultural industry in which we are also already existing, except for, of course, several thousand enlightened individuals like you and I, who, of course, will be reading more Schelling or Heidegger, but all others will be watching TV and not the most progressive shows on TV, as I said. So this is the first question. And the second question, which is related, is whether you don't underestimate the internal logic of technology, which is, of course, connected with very disciplined, compartmentalized, rationalized in a bad sense, time and space, right? When you rely on robots, you don't really rely on these kind of wonderful cyborgs from the West world. You rely usually on the very, how to say, mechanical operations. And the robotization is then likely to lead to the further colonization of the life world by rationalistic technology. And this is where all this human flourishing will lead to. We will become slaves of platforms, as Nietzsche rightly says, of other robots, other technologies. And the free time will make us more and not less vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. Free time is a very dangerous thing if you don't have a project to fill it.
Okay, so that's the end of the question. Okay, I think I managed to catch most of that. So, but there were parts where it's a little bit difficult to hear. So forgive me if I don't fully address the question. The gist that I got was okay. So essentially, what constitutes human flourishing? You know, if we're going to have all of this free time, what are we going to do with it? Doesn't it just mean that we're going to be sort of slaves of the technologies will be doing all the useful and interesting stuff, and we'll be doing nothing. We'll be watching TV. I think there's a sort of two-pronged response to that. The first would be to question why it is that the idea of people doing nothing and just watching TV all day is seen to be fundamentally problematic. I suggest that we have internalized the work ethic to such an extent that the idea of people doing nothing feels fundamentally objectionable to us. Well, I actually think, you know, this goes back to the classic right to be lazy. I think if people, I believe fundamentally in people's autonomy and their ability to make the decisions about what's right for them. If people want to do nothing all day, then by all means, they should be allowed to do nothing all day. But I also think that what studies have suggested is that with less work, people spend time cultivating other activities, other pursuits. So, you know, you always get academics in particular imagining this new post-work world order around. People will read books all the time, and, you know, we'll we'll go for long runs, we'll have a fantastic time. And, you know, there's a whole wealth of activities that could happen within this frame of free time. To some extent, I am wary about imagining in advance what meaningful free time could involve or would look like. Not least because our sense of what free time is right now is entirely based around recuperation from work. Our free time is, at the moment, is a space of recovery. It's a space of trying to sort of recharge so we can get back out there. So it's hard to imagine what genuine free time would look like or involve. Sorry, my baby's just come back from his walk crying. So, but you know, this is one fundamental thing, is that actually having free time might enable us to seriously think about how we reconfigure the relationships that underpin reproductive labor. Like at the moment, you know, we just sort of, I think a lot of us are just coping. A lot of the time we're being funneled into relationships and means of existing simply because they are the most available. So, you know, all of the housing stock, for example, encourages us to form heterosexual nuclear units and, you know, everything. We don't have the agency to reimagine what the reproductive sphere could look like. And I think actually a post-work world is one in which we have the space to engage those questions. And that's the fundamental thing, not the exact content of our fantasies of post-work, because I think that will be extremely varied depending on who you ask, but actually having a society organized around an engagement with what we want to do with time. By being able to have the question of what do we want to do with our free time? I think being able to engage that question fundamentally constitutes the realm of freedom to some extent. So hopefully that answered your question a little bit.
Thank you. If anyone in the audience have any other questions, I would like to read some questions out. So you do have a question here. Can you please come closer? Preferably in this seat. Работает. Просто нужно близко быть к ноутбуку.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. I've got a question, maybe it's a stupid one, and maybe you have mentioned it before, I just missed it, so I apologize in advance. I thought that many of us, or just some of us, used to think of work as an important part of our life, right? It's not just something that gets us income, right? It's not just a burden. It is something that shapes us, shapes our individuality, especially creative work. And so what is work in post-work theory? Is it just a burden that we need to get rid of? Or is it something else? Is it something more? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I think this very closely, if again, apologies, it's quite difficult to hear, but I think this relates quite closely to the question that we just had. So what is the work in post-work politics? What is the work that we want to make post? So the argument in the talk was fundamentally that it shouldn't just be wage labor, but it should be extended to other forms of activity, particularly to drudgery or burdensome forms of work that impinge upon the realm of freedom. So that is the understanding of work that I'm kind of engaging with. And one sort of very common response to this is the sense in which, well, work is important for people, it's important for people's identities, people enjoy work, what would we be without work, you know, and I think those questions are kind of, they sadden me a little bit, just because there is this, what work has become is this social realm. It's become the only way that people can access human contact. You know, it's where people find their friends, it's where people do something that gives them a sense of meaning. But actually, I think that's a rather depressing idea, that all of our scope for human connection and human flourishing has been poured into one realm of activity, which is very often, if not always, at the service of capital. You know, so I think in some ways doing this kind of filleting operation, thinking about what it is within work as we currently understand it, that we take to be meaningful, significant, enjoyable, important, and thinking, well, to what extent can that be extricated from a framework of surplus value production or a framework of providing the underpinnings for global capitalism? You know, how can it be reclaimed? Because I think all of the things that we enjoy about work are quite separate from the structures in which we find it. You know, I think there's a lot of ways in which we could imagine the qualities, the positive qualities that we currently think about in relation to work, in relation to a broader idea of sort of autonomous, meaningful activity. So taking away this sort of the dogma of the work ethic that suggests that all of our value as human beings is tied up with our productive capacity, with our willingness to labor, you know, and thinking outside of that very rigid and I think just fundamentally hostile to people kind of framework.
Thank you. If questions from the audience are completed, I would like to ask my brief question, and then we read 2 or maybe 3 questions from the Zoom chat that you, as the audience, do not see, unfortunately. So my brief question for you, Helen, is the whole problem of ownership of the technology and the decommodification of it from the hands of private corporations is not clear for me from your lecture. And if you propose that the ecology of organizations that can be used to advance this post-work rhetoric can only be some lobbyist groups, think tanks, and not actually valid political organizations, how can the means of technological production and advances be ripped out from the hands of that corporations? Because as I see this, the whole emancipatory potential of the technology cannot be fully administered through these corporate means.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. Yeah, I think that's a fundamental point in terms of Hagelin's idea of revaluing value, and you know, it's central to Marx as well. This idea that productivity enhancing technologies will only be used to further extract surplus value within a capitalist context. So they will never have emancipatory gains for human beings under the current system, which is why it's so crucial to think about whether these technologies can be appropriated and repurposed. I think essential to that question is realizing that technologies are not inherently negative, they're not inherently positive, but they're not inherently neutral either. They have fundamentally been designed with a set of affordances in mind, and those affordances are for the extraction of surplus value. You know, they're about generating profit. And these are particularly these productive technologies that we're talking about here. So that's why I think Badiou's point carries a lot of weight. You know, you do have to think about changing models of ownership and property alongside changing ideas about work. I don't think it makes sense to think about one without the other. And I think this is really important in terms of thinking about post-work, is if post-work isn't, as I've argued, a set of sort of neatly numbered steps, A, B, C equals post-work, neither is it a self-contained project that has to be seen entirely on its own. So post-work isn't a sort of panacea. It's not the solution to all of the issues that bleed out of global capitalism. Instead, it has to be seen as one element of a wider post-scarcity project. So I think thinking about post-work as a set of emphases. So it is the branch of a broader post-scarcity project that concentrates upon the elimination of drudgery. You know, so arguing against drudgery as part of this wider model of what a post-scarcity society should look like. And, you know, obviously ownership and property are a really important part of that, but I'd say also things like bodily autonomy, which doesn't fit into this idea of ownership and property or the idea of work. You know, the idea of freedom from violence is fundamental to a post-scarcity economy, post-scarcity society. So all of these things might interact with work to some extent. They might sort of come into conversation with work in particular ways, but it would be a mistake to reduce them to work. So essentially post-work is part of a bigger approach to social overhaul. And it's a way of channeling particular thought into this one significant area of it. I mean, I think work is particularly important under current social conditions because everybody has a relationship to it. Whether you have access to wage labor or not, you know, you have a relationship to work. We are all, in one way or another, subjects of work, whether that's because we're too young to work, we're too old to work, we don't have access to work, we are reproductive laborers in a waged or an unwaged sense, we're productive laborers, whatever. We're constantly looking for work, we're in insecure employment, there's a relationship there. So there is this sort of mass of human experience around the idea of work that makes it potentially a valuable thing to mobilize around right now. But it obviously does have to go beyond that. In terms of how you introduce this appropriation of existing productive infrastructure in the name of a sort of more emancipatory goal, I think that's a really difficult question. I do think, you know, there are examples within this idea of the ecology of organization, the role of think tanks and kind of steering things more towards public ownership. In the UK, which is the context with which I'm most familiar, there are, just as sort of the think tank autonomy is doing work around labour and the shortening of the working week and things like this, you've got think tanks like Commonwealth who are doing this work around ownership and property models and thinking about bringing things into public ownership. And you're sort of starting to see hints of those ideas coming with sort of the decommodification of technical infrastructure in the form of broadband. So the Labour Party recently suggested that actually having broadband be a public utility, so having that be taken in and provided freely by the state. You know, that's part of a sort of decommodification process, the beginnings of something maybe. But in terms of being able to offer you a very nice, forceful, easy to follow set of guidelines about how we wrest technology away from property and capital, I just don't have anything to offer you other than to say I recognise its significance and its importance, and that post-work isn't going to get us anywhere unless we think about also this sort of like post-private property mindsets as well.
Thank you. We have a question from our Zoom participant, from Allah, if I presume.
Yes, dear Helen, I have a question which is a bit off top. Right now, in parallel with your talk, there is a talk of Luciano Parisi and Duke. And my question is about genealogy of xenofeminism and about your relationships with Luciano Parisi and her ideas.
Well, I mean, Luciana is an amazing thinker. I like her work very much. I've only met her in person once, but she's always been a really big supporter of xenofeminism. You know, I think she's particularly interesting because she's got these sort of historical connections with the CCRU and so the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit at Warwick University, which was really big in the 90s and provided a sort of a radical exploration of the way increasing sort of networked connectivity was transforming the space of politics. And so, yeah, I mean, she's definitely part of the ecosystem of ideas that informs xenofeminism, both through her connection with the CCRU and otherwise. I think she is, she's very attentive to the sort of the philosophical nuances of a techno-feminist discourse, and so she's a really interesting interlocutor. And I'm very honoured that she has had, you know, even the inclination to take up the ideas and to read them and respond to them in her own work. I think of her as an ally and a fellow traveller, and, you know, hopefully over time we'll further draw her into the clutches of Laboria Cubonics.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So I now will read out questions from chat, so our audience can understand what you're answering to. So, question from Daria Manjura. The idea of post-war definitely sounds very appealing, and you mentioned some policies which may be moving us towards this direction. of freeing our creative potential. But on the global scale, it seems to be quite difficult to implement in less liberal, in quotes, countries, or countries where the war is going on or where the religion shapes a big part of human life. To give some examples. What are the steps to reach a post-war state in this situation? How to accelerate in these situations?
I mean, you know, that's an incredibly difficult question to answer, because it's not just that it's difficult to implement post-work ideas within less liberal countries. It's difficult to implement post-work ideas in liberal countries. You know, it's difficult full stop, because it's about a fundamental reorientation. In terms of what sort of the post-work philosophers can do, I think they're already kind of doing it, in the sense that, well, they're trying to produce the work, they're trying to disseminate the ideas, they're trying to create a discussion space in which the idea of moving away from a work ethic can gain some traction. But there's this sort of strange distributed kind of process by which change happens. It's very hard to point to a cause and effect narrative where if we just do this, then this will happen. Because if that was the case, then I'm sure we'd all be doing X with because we're determined to get to Y, you know? So there's partly this speculative dimension of trying to advance ideas, trying to test them, trying to create the scope for others to take them up and do things with them. I think one of the limitations with the idea of ecology of organizations, as I've kind of articulated it, in relation to the emergence of think tanks and trying to use them to sort of push the Overton window to create sort of new ways in which these ideas can get traction, is that they tend to happen on a local level. So, you know, I do a lot of work with autonomy. Autonomy is based in London. It spends a lot of time talking to London-based politicians and activists. Also spends a lot of time talking to other think tanks and organizations based in London. So it becomes very narrow in terms of its scope, unless other people sort of pick up on it. So we've done some work in Europe, because the European agencies and organizations have contacted us and said, well, will you do things with us? So we start to spread the tentacles a little bit through that mechanism. But then how we get to those less liberal countries that are dealing with their own situations, I'm not sure. We can only hope to provide resources for local struggles as far as we can. I know that's a very frustrating and unhelpful answer to that question, but it's all I got. We've got to kind of acknowledge the limits here, and trying to build up resources, establish a body of resources that can be used, do what we can to reach out to those, to other people in other contexts when they have an interest in taking up those ideas, and hope that there's some kind of, that we can provide a kind of ideological infrastructure that might facilitate a further organic spread of these ideas.
Okay, and probably the last question, if I may, Lina Bulakova asks, I wonder how this theory deals with wider bioethical aspects of post-work, aside from definitely positive overcoming of certain social problems and considering that this change is probably inevitable. Would it be real freedom? Doesn't it sound too privileged point of view of those with deep knowledge of what is happening in the human world, ontologically changed by machines, who will enjoy our freedom and start making plans for Monday morning and not feel like lost bodies in a world of lost meaning? What kind of adaptation is assumed here?
Yeah, I think that question gestures to this idea that it is a radical orientation, that in some ways when we talk about post-work and we think, okay, well, an idea of post-work freedom just means that we have to work less easy. I think what that question gets to is that the very idea of having to work less is gesturing towards this idea of work not being the sort of central peg, the scaffolding on which we overlay the idea of what it means to be human. So it is a fundamental sort of root and branch uprooting of what we have currently come to understand a meaningful life to be. And that, yes, there is a sort of, the void of freedom looms before us, basically. Like, it's not just a, yay, post-work now. It's like, oh my God, a fundamental re-changing of how we understand the human. But I think it's really crucial to remember that post-work is an orientation towards freedom. So I've said before that it's not necessarily about the content of these post-work visions. It's not necessarily me saying what I would do, you know, in terms of a post-work world, what I would do if I had to work less. It's about this fundamental need to make the extension of the realm of freedom the central spoke of what an emancipatory left project means. So it's a fundamentally Promethean idea that we shouldn't take as read, or we shouldn't sort of assume that there are elements of our world that are not open to re-engineering in the name of collective freedom. Like, that's the fundamental orientation. So that's what's at the heart of post-work for me, is understanding that the extension of freedom is the point, the perpetual orientation. And this is very much a vector and not an endpoint. We don't arrive at freedom and say, oh, we did it, you guys. Post-work, it's over now. We've reached the utopian endpoint. It's always about this orientation of moving towards extending freedom, having the space to ask the questions and to query what it means to be human. So standing on the edge of this void of freedom that looms before us, is the crucial part of post-work. It's confronting this vertiginous feeling of, well, what am I without work? What am I beyond work?
Okay, we have two more questions, and
I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid. I can hear that my baby is crying, and he has been for about 5 minutes. I'm really, really sorry. I'm really sorry. But somebody needs to eat. My realm of freedom is being curtailed by the realm of necessity in the form of a screaming baby.
Okay, thank you for your time and for your
work.
For your work in general.
Thank you.
And congrats.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's been a real pleasure. And I'm sorry to the people whose questions I haven't had time to answer. Hopefully, maybe there'll be another opportunity if I'm invited again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Ну что, классно. Я не успела спросить про Розу Люксембург, почему тот же дискурс, но не упоминается.
Всем спасибо.
Всем спасибо,
что пришли.
Пойдемте на автопати.
Да. Следующее заседание Либромарксизма будет, скорее всего, где-то в октябре. Таких мероприятий будет еще больше и еще крупнее.
Да.
Спасибо.